Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nick Behrens. I'm General Manager of Advocacy at the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Queensland. I'd like to thank each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come along to CCIQ's Energy Power Forum this morning in beautiful sunny Brisbane. The Queensland energy sector is a significant issue for all Queenslanders, particularly small and medium businesses who view recent electricity price rises as being unsustainable. Indeed, most Queensland businesses will have seen an effective doubling of their electricity bills over the last 6 years. Accordingly, the efficient planning and management of the energy sector and emerging issues are of critical importance if Queensland electricity prices are going to be competitive over the next 30 years. It is essential that careful consideration be given to Queensland's future energy arrangements. There are a number of issues that must be resolved. Without intervention, it is conceivable that electricity prices will continue to rise by the same increases that have been experienced year after year. Queensland businesses have become numb to the rhetoric on electricity prices over the previous years, and that is why CCIQ is pleased to see this state government's commitment to addressing the problem, who are already demonstrating resolve to take action. The state government are now seeking feedback from business on a number of proposals and reforms which will shape the future of Queensland's energy sector. Ladies and gentlemen, through this forum and the workshop afterwards, your business today has a say on the electricity prices of tomorrow. Things that will be discussed will include focusing on price competitiveness, ensuring a reliable network, removing regulatory barriers, and facilitating greater private sector involvement in bringing online additional generation capacity within Queensland, particularly for regional Queensland. The format of this morning will include presentations from the Minister for Energy and Water Supply, Mark McArdle, on Queensland Government's priorities and commitments, the Chairman of the Queensland Competition Authority, Malcolm Roberts, on electricity prices past, present and future, and the Deputy Director General of Energy at the Department of Energy and Water Supply, Karen Masnada, on Queensland's electricity reform agenda. Karen and Malcolm will then be joined by Alan Jones, CEO of Power Choice, and Chris Thompson, Managing Director of Infinity Power, to form a Q&A expert panel open for questions from the audience. Questions can also be sent in via Twitter feed using the hashtag CCIQ Power Forum, and we will additionally be streaming the forum for our members from CCIQ's website, particularly for those members in regional Queensland. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would like to introduce the Minister for Energy and Water Supply, Mark McArdle. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick, and can I acknowledge yourself and CCIQ, and thank you for inviting myself here today. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Malcolm Roberts, Chairman QCA, and Karen Masnada, DDG Electricity Reform from my department. Look, let's start with the bleeding obvious, and that is power prices have risen significantly in the past 6 or 7 years, and they've impacted upon both the domestic and the commercial markets. There is no doubt that the power price rises have impacted upon cash flow, have impacted upon the capacity of business to train and retain staff, and also acknowledge the fact that business, both small and medium-sized businesses, are in fact critical to the development of Queensland's economy. The Queensland Government makes no bones about the fact that we want to engage with business in developing Queensland, not just in relation to businesses itself, but also the growth economically of this great state. And that's why, in regard to the 4 pillars, we are looking at resources, construction, tourism and agriculture. Make no doubt that at the very core of each of those businesses is in fact small and medium-sized businesses. Make no doubt that this government acknowledges the role that you play in this great state. In fact, 96% of all businesses in Queensland are small businesses. and 412,000 small businesses across the state employ 1/2 of the private sector employees, and they contribute 46% to the GSP, a very important component and an acknowledgement by the government that in working with you, we can achieve better outcomes for yourself and indeed our economy. But to do that, we need a power sector that is resilient, that is cost-effective, and is customer-focused. We need to understand, however, to achieve those goals, what have been the drivers for power increases over the past 6 or 7 years. And without doubt, it has been in large measure the poles and wire issues, the poles and wires that have been placed across the state in large numbers over the past 5 or 6 years. Indeed, at this point in time, the debt level by Powerlink, Ergon and Energex is something like $13.5 billion. And each year, we pay an interest component of around $500 million because of that debt. But there are other issues as well. There's clearly the carbon tax, and can I make it quite clear that senators of all colours, in my opinion, must heed the mandate given to Tony Abbott to remove the carbon tax. But there are also the green schemes that do have an impact upon power prices. Now, the government per se is not opposed to green schemes, but what we are opposed to is schemes that are heavily subsidised, because, with all due respect, subsidies are paid for by somebody at some point in time. Green schemes that have not had proper R&D undertaken and are then subsidised, in my opinion, do not assist long-term planning for the energy sector. In my opinion, green schemes must be commercially viable and compete in the marketplace with every other source of energy to be a viable competitor. The issue that Nick raised of competition is squarely also in the focus of where this government is heading to. Where do we drive competition into the future to give you the opportunities to engage with better long-term contracts so that you get a better deal and therefore the economy gets a better deal? The government, looking at those and other factors, has focused on fundamental reform. That is, looking at a large work program and also a 30-year electricity strategy. Now, the price rises that came through in July of this year were significant. We don't deny that at all. But can I make this point? If we had subsidised those price rises, we would never have tackled the problem. The government agonised for a long time as to what we were going to do. But we determined the only way to deal with this matter was, in fact, to look at what was driving prices. You have to understand the problem and then attack the problem, and at root cause and analysis deal with those issues. To do that, I established an independent review panel last year to look very closely at network costs. That is, why are poles and wires so expensive? Why are the debt levels so high? And what can we do to drive those levels down? In addition, I put in place an interdepartmental committee comprised of my department, Treasury and DPC to look at holistic answers moving forward over a timeline to establish whole of energy sector reform. We now have an agenda of some 60 items, and in essence, they fall under 3 categories. We do need to look at infrastructure. We do need to maximise competition and protect consumers. And thirdly, and importantly, what is the future role of government going forward in this sector? If you look at the infrastructure scenario, I've outlined to you the debt levels that now currently exist. But the issues we're looking at are basically this. How do we improve network security? How do we improve reliability standards? How do we look at network regulation and planning practices, the efficiencies of the system, demand management where applicable, and network connection processes? The documentation that we've established indicates that between 13-14 and 19-20, we can save some $5 billion in CapEx. That is $5 billion that has not been put on the ticker. That is $5 billion that we are not paying interest for going forward. All these issues are to do one thing: put downward pressure on prices. to make certain that we get an efficient system that delivers long-term for all Queenslanders, both domestic and commercial, a better return for their investment. But in addition to that, we need to look at tariffs. We need to look at the tariff structure that in some places has been there for 30 or 40 years. We're no longer living in the 1960s and 1970s, it's now 2013, and we need to bring tariffs into the modern era. There are committees comprising Energex, Ergon, the QCA, retailers and government that are doing just that. And their goal is to establish a better use of power by business, education of businesses and consumers, and the use of new technology. Now, we know that in Victoria, the government rolled out the smart meter phenomena. It was an unmitigated disaster, and the reason was simply this. They told the community they were going to get it, the community didn't know what it was, and they rejected it. Now, smart meters can have a role to play here in Queensland, but not on a compulsory basis. Not on a compulsory basis. They can certainly assist consumers across the markets in relation to understanding how they're using power, when they're using power, and how they can best use power for their own benefit. This is where industry in particular, in regards to how you use power, when you use power, can advise us, that is government, how we can structure the industry moving forward. It is so important that we get your feedback, and again, I congratulate you for being here today. Government can only do so much. It is by the input of people such as yourselves and your businesses that we can learn a lot more about how to deal with these matters. But turn now to maximising competition and consumer protections. We need to give you access to the best deals possible by way of contracts. Now, I know in South East Queensland, most of you are on market contracts at this point in time. We also need to, in my opinion, remove regulated price controls by mid-2015 in the southeast corner. We need to improve the level of retail competition. We also need to understand what protections you need and also education that you need to better use these contracts and choices available to you. Can I make the point? Victoria showed me very clearly that unless you educate the people who are going to use a product, you are never going to be successful in the rollout of that product. You are in business yourself. Half of your exercise is explaining to the consumer what they can do with your product. It's exactly the same here. So education is a cornerstone in relation to competition. We also need to make certain that there are certain customers in this state who need protections. There's no doubt about that. Recently in the newspaper, there was an article involving a major retailer that we had to take to task in regard to practice they had. Now, I make no bones about that. I make no apologies for that. Retailers have a role to play. The government will not back away from protecting consumers, whether residential or business, from retailers who try and manipulate the system. In addition, we want to remove entry barriers for new retailers. We want to make certain that there is sufficient retail competition in the southeast corner so that you have an informed choice and a choice across a range of products. In the ergon sector, that is a bit more difficult for various reasons, mainly because of the size of the area, the population spread, and the enormous distances required to transmit power across more remote regions of the state. But we're also working on that. We also believe that that can occur and should occur to provide the best incentives for business right across Queensland. But that does not come at a cost of the uniform tariff policy. The government is committed to doing that and maintaining that. For those of you who may not be aware of the UTP, what it means in essence is this. If you live in remote or regional Queensland or in the ergon sector, you don't pay any more for your power than we pay down here. Now, in 13-14, the government will subsidise that to the tune of over $600 million, and we'll keep that ongoing. That's been going since about the 1960s, and governments of all colours have followed that practice. The most important, or at least an equally important role, in my opinion, is what is the role of government going forward. To date, the government has looked at very closely this sector, and we are now working through the processes involved, that with retail competition opening up, that with the protections in place, that with consumer law in place, what is the effective role of government in the future? And can I make the point very clear? We're not selling Powerlink, Ergon and Energex. So let's knock off that question right now. We are, however, considering whether CS Energy and Stanwell may go to the market. But if we do that, we'll only do so after we get a mandate from the people at the 2015 election campaign. We have looked very closely at the Commission of Audit report, and the response by the government is now in the public arena. Having made those comments and highlighting the fact that the immediate look and the immediate outcomes are critical, it is also critical now that we look down the track, that we look at 30 years down the track, that we understand as best we can how to grapple with the concerns that are arising now and will in time to come. Can I go back just a few years in my life? Back in 1989, I was living in Mackay, and I was working for a legal firm. And I saw a chap walking by, and he had what looked like a brick stuck to his right ear, and he was holding it. It was the first commercially available mobile telephone. That now is an iPhone. That now does so many different things compared to 1989 that they are unrecognisable placed side by side. Technology in the next 30 years will be a significant player in the power sector. Let me give you an example. Solar PV is now on something like 300,000 roofs right across Queensland. There's no question that solar has an impact in regard to the sector, but the next horizon, we've all heard it before, is solar batteries. The impact of solar batteries. I can buy solar batteries now and literally not require the grid for $40,000. Compare the cost of solar panels 10 years ago with what they are now. That drop in price will be mirrored in the drop in price in relation to solar batteries as time goes by. This technology is now with us, and it will change dramatically how we deal, how we interact, and more importantly, how commercial and also the domestic market use power. Those are some of the challenges. In Singapore, there is a desal plant that is now constructing a power station next to it that will generate 411 megawatts. They will use 60 megawatts and sell the balance into the grid. This form of generation in relation to tying it to a desal plant or other areas is how the market is going to change in Australia. There are horizon technologies that both Karen and Malcolm will talk about later that will change forever how we deal with power in this state. I can't tell you now what that will look like in 30 years' time, but I can tell you this. Unless you're in the game and unless you're thinking about what the outcomes are going to be, you will be washed away in time to come. It's that important. PVs in this state generate 1 gigawatt of power. That is more than some of our small power generators at this point in time. What we want to do is understand by putting in place an expert panel to advise the government as to what the changes will be, what the horizon issues are going to be, and then potentially deal with those issues going forward. The long-term view of power in Queensland at this point is unknown. But the long-term solutions have now got to be thought about. If we think about living in a 30-year time zone, you at least are in the right spot to start understanding the concerns that you will face in time to come. And again, This is where business becomes very, very, very important. It's where you, with your experience and your knowledge in your sector, provides to us the input to develop that strategy. And I certainly urge you to make a contribution. I noticed in the paper presented to the department by the organisation, you raised the question of 2020-2021 being the horizon demand for more power in Queensland, based upon the AEMO forecasts. I have to say that looking at the AEMO forecasts of the past 3 or 4 years, they haven't really been on the mark. They haven't really been all that accurate. And in fact, at this point in time, based upon who you listen to or who you read, it is either flat or going down. By the same token, the 30-year plan is there to pick up what the demand forecast will be in the future, so that we can plan with you and the private sector in generating the power you need in time to come. Ladies and gentlemen, the government sees energy, the requirement for planning and the requirement for reform as a major block in the development of Queensland. That's why we have gone down this very difficult and very long road to ensure long-term outcomes are achieved. But again, I repeat, it is not by government alone that this can be attained. It is only by working together that we can achieve a long-term solution. I am very, very committed and emotionally tied to achieving these goals. We often talk about domestic markets as being at the forefront of our mind. But the economy is driven by business. The economy and employment levels dictate how we progress in years to come. Our fortune as a government is tied parallel to that of yourselves. We are going to work with you, and we are going to achieve together the goals that we need in the short, medium and long term. Both Karen and Malcolm are presenting papers here this morning, and I urge you to engage with them and give them both a very hard time. Particularly Karen. Can I conclude by making this commitment? We are with you every step of the way, and we'll together find a solution to this very, very serious problem. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Minister. I don't think any business can question the resolve of this state government to deliver a competitive business operating environment for Queensland, particularly underpinned by competitive electricity prices. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Malcolm Roberts, Chairman of the Queensland Competition Authority. Prior to his appointment to the QCA, Dr. Roberts was Chief Executive of the Energy Networks Association after many years in other industry associations and the federal government. He's been Executive Director of the National Generators Forum, Policy Director for the Australian National Retailers Association and Chief Executive at the Housing Industry Association. Dr. Roberts will be discussing electricity prices past, present and future.
Oh, thank you, Nick, for that introduction. Nick's also warned me about operating the PowerPoint slides. I should apologise for the fact of inflicting PowerPoint on you at breakfast time. First, I should thank the Chamber for the opportunity to speak here today in front of 200 leaders in Queensland's small business community. The QCA welcomes the engagement we've had with CCIQ this year, and we see CCIQ as a very important partner in our outreach to the business community. It's a pleasure to share the stage with the Minister and Karen. The Minister's obviously a hard act to follow. He's outlined the government's strategy to contain rising electricity prices. He's outlined an ambitious reform strategy to deal with the immediate causes, the legacy, if you like, of past policy decisions and of powerful trends in the market that have pushed up prices in recent years, and also have the ambition to look at the long-term future for Queensland over a span of 3 decades. That's all very exciting stuff. Now, unfortunately, I'm a regulator and we're a dreary bunch. We focus on the issues that we have to deal with at hand. And for us, that's the next one, is the price determination we need to make for electricity prices in 2015-16. So what I'll do this morning is go through a hopefully not too painful PowerPoint presentation that will explain a little bit about what's been driving electricity prices. That'll give you a sense of what are the pressures in the market that have forced prices up. My crystal ball's not working very well at the moment, so I can't give you a very good forecast of what prices might be in 15-16. Unfortunately, we'll all have to wait until about the middle of December for when we release our draft determination to give people a sense of what the prices will be, the notified prices will be for the next financial year. I'm just going to see if I've listened to Nick. Yes, I have. Well, as the Minister said, to state the obvious, and Nick also referred to it in his opening remarks, we're here because electricity prices have been rising sharply over the last 6 or 7 years. In effect, that's doubling the Tariff 20, the main small business tariff, over that time. You can see there have been fluctuations from year to year, but the trend is unmistakable. It's helpful to sort of break down the electricity supply chain so you can see the different pressures at work. This is a very simple breakdown. It shows that we obviously have a generation sector, networks, poles and wires, if you like, the infrastructure that delivers electricity to the home or business. We have green policies, the carbon tax, the solar bonus scheme, the renewable energy target, and we have the costs the retailers incur to deliver and sell electricity. All that obviously constitutes the bill. For Tariff 20, one of the interesting things here is the cost of producing electricity. The wholesale price is only 15% of your bill. Half the bill is your network's cost, transmission and distribution, and roughly the same proportion of your bill as devoted to generation is the green schemes, solar, carbon tax, renewable energy target, and at the end of that process, the retailer's own costs. Now, for the 13-14 year, Tariff 20 increased for the typical business customer by $220. And you can see the breakdown there. You can see where across the board, effectively, we had an increase in cost pressures that amounted to $220 at the end of the day. Again, you can see the network cost increase was significant. The solar bonus scheme is rising sharply. I'll have a little bit more to say about it later, but that is a cost that will increase over the next 2 years. Now, so they're the big four. I actually had a picture of Albert Dürer's Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, but I thought that wasn't a very good way to approach it. These are the four factors, general factors we've talked about. Wholesale, so the cost that is involved in producing electricity, the networks to deliver it, the policies decisions to essentially reduce the emissions intensity of generation, reduce our emissions output, and the costs incurred by retailers. We've been pretty fortunate in Queensland. You may not feel that way, but we've been pretty fortunate in Queensland because the spot market price has been, with the exception of the drought in the middle of that slide, falling in real terms since the national electricity market was created at the end of the 1990s. That sounds a bit counterintuitive, that we're facing regularly increasing electricity prices, but the wholesale price, the price of generating power, has been falling or flat for a long time. And we're no exception. This is New South Wales and Victoria. You can see that they've bounced around much the same, but until very, very recently, the wholesale price was far lower than it was in 1998-99. Obvious question, why? Well, early in the piece, and the Minister's referred to this, there were robust assessments about what demand was likely to do. The Australian economy is an energy-intensive economy. We have had regular increases in consumption, household and business, for many years. And the best estimates at the time, and I'm using hindsight here rather than insight, the best estimates at the time was that that would continue, that we would see continual growth in energy demand. So that was the forecast demand in the national electricity market. The national electricity market is Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Tasmania. Nearly always forget Tasmania. The bottom line was what we thought demand was going to be way back in 2007, 8, 9. and the blue line is the changes in generation capacity, so the additional generation that was built in anticipation of that increased demand, and also to be there to replace ageing assets that were going to be retired. Obviously here in Queensland, Swanbank B is one of those assets. What's actually happened, when we look at the green line, is that around 2009-10 we started seeing a sharp fall in demand. So you can see that our forecasts weren't very good, and the generation capacity that was brought online in anticipation of continuing growth and demand has now been effectively stranded. Much less demand, over-investment, if you like, in capacity and generation, and that's what's fed through into the pool price, amongst other things. Networks are usually the next cab off the rank. This is an indication that over time we've had to have a significant reinvestment in the network. If we go back a few years, the debate about networks was all about reliability. It was all about an infrastructure that was facing very, very high demands and was delivering a level of service that the community as a whole felt wasn't reliable. So there was a determination to increase investment in the network to improve reliability. And network spending does tend to be cyclical as you replace ageing assets and as you augment capacity to meet new demand. So over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in the capital investment back into the network to replace assets, refurbish assets, build new capacity. And we can see that the costs of doing that have risen very sharply over that time, from a very low historical base. The revenues needed to recover that CapEx has also increased sharply. These are obviously all feeding into our electricity bills. The Minister's outlined some of the measures the government is looking at to ensure that investment is prudent and efficient and the costs are being minimised. The green costs. As you can see, about 15% of the Tariff 20 bill is related to government decisions about trying to reduce emissions, improve the green content, if you like, of our electricity supply. Retail. Now, retail, we have a very unusual market in Queensland. On the one hand, we have a very concentrated market. In southeast Queensland, two retailers have 83% of the customers. Outside southeast Queensland, in the Ergon area, Ergon has virtually everyone. Very concentrated market. But we do have a competitive market in southeast Queensland. 70% of the small customers are on market contracts, and those market contracts generally offer a discount to the notified price set by the QCA. Nearly all the large users in southeast Queensland, of course, are on market contracts. And the latest analysis shows about half of the offers in the market at the moment for Tariff 11, the main residential tariff, are offering a discount, with discounts up to about 11%. Outside southeast Queensland, unfortunately, there's very weak competition. In part, that's because the uniform tariff policy subsidy that the Minister mentioned is delivered by Ergon's retail business rather than to its network business, which has the effect of essentially locking out competitors, retail competitors. But at the same time, all but the large users on notified prices, but some large users are in the market. The uniform tariff policy has had, unfortunately, a positive and a negative effect for regional customers. It's lowered prices substantially because the cost of delivering electricity in regional Queensland is obviously higher than it is in the more dense southeast Queensland market, but it's stifled competition. That's been identified by the government as a serious issue, and there's more work being done on that. This is where the crystal ball gets very, 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 very hazy. Future price increases. Here's just some of the factors that are going to influence future prices. We've got the network costs. As you've seen, it's half the bill. And as you've seen, there's been a significant reinvestment back in that infrastructure that's led to rapid increase in costs from the networks. The solar subsidies, the solar bonus scheme, the PV feed-in tariff, isn't a large part of the bill, but as I'll show a little later, it's rising quickly. Repeal of the carbon tax will reduce costs. There's no doubt about that, although there's a bit of an argument at times about exactly how much that reduction might be. Changes in demand. The position that a lot of people find counterintuitive is that the less we use electricity, the more we'll pay for it.
we've got huge fixed costs to be recovered from demand. And when demand falls, the unit price of that has to rise. And then there's also the question about what's going to happen with wholesale energy. That we've had a long period where wholesale energy costs have been falling in real terms or flat. There has been about 2,000 megawatts of capacity withdrawn from the national market. Some pundits say we'll need to lose 5,000 before we see significant change in the cost of generation. But nevertheless, the market will correct at some point, and this long period that we've enjoyed of relatively low or falling wholesale prices will change. So the good news, and I'm glad I can give you some good news, is that a major part of the costs for networks, close to about 60% or so, is really the return on their past investment, their CapEx. And there's a thing called the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, which is essentially the rate of return regulated businesses are guaranteed to incentivise them, if you like, to make the investment in their capital, in their infrastructure. And in 2015-16, that's going to fall substantially. I can't predict what that's going to be because here in Queensland we don't regulate the networks. That's done by the Australian Energy Regulator. But judging by most recent decisions by the AER, judging by what we're seeing in the market about the cost of capital for these businesses, we're anticipating a significant drop in the rate of return that these businesses are guaranteed. 7% is just indicative. It's just to bring home to you that a change in the WACC leads to significant changes in cost. So at the moment, the businesses have 9.72%. If today that was 7%, which may well be the WACC decision for 15-16 onwards, it would be $339 million less network revenue, which would translate into a significant change in network costs. There's also the repeal of the carbon tax. Now, our calculations, roughly speaking, for the average Tariff 20 customer, that might be $116. Residential customers could be $120 to $180 a year. Lots of different caveats placed on that, but the repeal of the carbon tax will definitely reduce or save customers money. Another bit of good news is that peak demand, which is the key driver for network investment, is bouncing around under that 9,000 mark. If that peak demand, so that's I should go back a step. Peak demand is essentially demand at the busiest time of the day. So that would maybe 4 to 8 o'clock in the evening. The networks have to build enough capacity to supply those relatively short-lived surges in demand, and that's expensive. And unfortunately, it also means that a great deal of capacity is built, paid for by the customer, but is used only used certain times of the day or at certain high temperature days, if you like, in summer. So peak demand's the driver. Peak demand's just the very top, probably short-lived burst of demand, and the network has to be built to provide electricity at that time. Peak demand's been bouncing around, but it hasn't been going above that level. So hopefully we will see that the investment we've made in networks, the augmented capacity that's been made, will be sufficient and will not require another large investment to catch up with short-lived increases in demand. I mentioned that the solar bonus, the feed-in tariff, the 44-cent feed-in tariffs are a reasonably modest part of the overall bill, but we are going to see in the next year or two some significant increases. What this complicated little chart shows is that essentially the cost for households and for businesses, because businesses are paying through their network charges for the feed-in tariff, is going to spike in 15-16. And that's for two reasons. The first one is that at the moment those costs are being recovered in arrears by the network businesses. When the solar bonus scheme was put in place by the previous government, demand was underestimated. Many more people have participated in that scheme than was originally expected. The systems they've installed have also been generally larger. So the revenue allowance, if you like, for the network businesses has been much less than what they're actually paying out. That money is recovered in arrears, so there's a lag effect, which means that when we get to 15-16, we'll have all the under-recovery from previous years being recovered in that year, plus we'll have the first full revenue decision from the AER allowing them to collect all the revenue for that year. So it's a double whammy. I'm sure I didn't explain that well. Suffice to say, the average residential customer is looking at paying $276 in 2015-16 to support the feed-in tariff. Businesses will be paying much the same. Oh, I did do this one. I saw Mike Swanson just a moment ago and said I stole one of your charts again. This is just to illustrate one of the big changes that's happening to our network. Bear in mind, the networks are a fixed cost business. Most of their costs are sunk, if you like, into the poles and wire infrastructure they operate. So the extent to which that infrastructure is used, the volume of electricity they sell out of the infrastructure will determine the price. And this is an indication of what's been happening at one particular substation on the Sunshine Coast, where, as you can see, for each year, demand at the off-peak period, if I can call it that, or the during the day period, has been consistently falling, and solar PV will be driving that. You can see from year after year the volume of electricity being sold in that location has been steadily falling. So the effect of falling volumes of sales leading to higher unit prices is there. And I've inflicted enough on you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Malcolm. The reason why the Chamber invited Dr. Roberts to present is we take the view that mapping a pathway to lower electricity prices or more competitive prices is only doable if we know our commencement point. And I think Dr. Roberts' presentation provides a very good overview of what is or what has been feeding previous electricity price rises and giving some indication of what we can reasonably expect. Opportunity for questions for Dr. Roberts will be available shortly. I'd like to now introduce Karen Masnada, Deputy Director General Energy at the Department of Energy and Water. Karen leads the energy group within the department. Her primary focus at present is leading the electricity reform agenda that the government has set, including short-term reforms arising from the Interdepartmental Committee on Energy Sector Reform, as well as the development and implementation of the 30-year electricity strategy. Prior to this role, Karen held economic advisory roles with PricewaterhouseCoopers and Deloitte. Before that, she held senior financial advisory roles with Queensland Treasury and Queensland Treasury Corporation. Karen will be speaking about Queensland's electricity reform agenda.
Thank you, Nick. And it's a great opportunity to present to this group because just talking to Mike Swanston of Energex before, he was giving me some stats on the importance of the small to medium-sized businesses in the southeast Queensland corner, and he was saying that roughly it's 10% in terms of numbers, but in terms of volume and consumption, it's 50%. So it's good to capture this group because often we get a lot of representation from large business and retail and consumer groups. So it's really important to have the opportunity to talk about the reform agenda and importantly seek some feedback. So obviously the Minister's spoken about the reform agenda, and I think it really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We've got a shift in the way the market operates, and that's been highlighted by Malcolm's presentation, and then also a government really committed to reform. So that's a rare combination and provides an exciting opportunity for us. So really just backing up what everyone has said, the key driver for the reforms is really the rising prices. And this chart here shows CPI, so that's the bottom line, and then compares the top line that goes more directly to the top is the residential tariff, so the standard tariff 11, and the one with a bit of a dip in the middle is the T20, so the standard business tariff. And that dip in the middle is to do with a pricing and a regulatory adjustment, which was a change in methodology which came in last year. So again, really backing up what Malcolm said, it's been driven largely by large network investment to meet peak demand and increasing reliability standards, suboptimal federal regulatory frameworks for networks, so that's the criticism that's been levied about is the AER, not to bash regulators, Malcolm, but is the AER effectively constraining investment and creating efficient returns? The layers of government green schemes and policies and suboptimal pricing arrangements. So that really tells a story that, as has been said before today, in the last 7 years there's been an effective doubling of prices, and that is a very strong platform for reform. So now just borrowing some statistics that came out of CCIQ's survey that it released this year. This represents the overall, the percentage of electricity or energy contributing to overall operating costs of businesses that participated in the survey. And it really shows two things. Firstly, that the impact on businesses vary. So some businesses experience less than 1% as a part of their overall costs, but others are up to greater than 25%. So electricity has a varying impact in terms of the overall cost contribution to the business. In terms of the ability to then address that and control costs, another very interesting thing coming out of that survey is really demonstrates that businesses have either done pretty much all they can do or only have marginal opportunity to better manage their costs. So the survey indicated that only 3.8 indicated that they thought they could reduce their costs significantly, and 41.5% thought they could reduce it marginally, which left greater than 50% indicating that they would struggle to find additional savings or measures to manage their electricity costs. So, as Minister McArdle's outlined, the government has announced a very broad reform agenda, and it has indicated that it's looking at the whole supply chain. So that is generation, the networks, and also the way retail competition works. And that's really broken down into two strategies. One is the short-term reform agenda, which really has a 1 to 3 year time horizon. And as the Minister indicated, that is looking at the Interdepartmental Committee on Electricity Sector Reform, which is the whole supply chain, the independent review panel that was led by Tony Ballas, looking really at the efficiency of network businesses, so Powerlink, Energex and Ergon, and finally the Commission of Audit, which was led by Peter Costello, an independent review that really looked at the whole of state fiscal position but had some very specific recommendations around energy, uniform tariff policy, and whether or not government should continue to own energy businesses. Not long after the short-term reform program was announced, the Minister also announced that he was going to look at a long-term reform and a 30-year electricity strategy. And the reason he did this was to firstly inform the shorter-term reform agenda, because a lot of policy has been implemented quickly without considering the whole supply chain or longer-term impacts, and they wanted to avoid that. And secondly, they wanted to really have a strategic focus about what the future held and look beyond electoral cycles. So that's why they really took that broader long-term view. So what I'll do, now the Minister's obviously given you a high-level indication of the IDC outcomes or the short-term reform agenda, but I might quickly summarise that and give you some examples of what that might mean. So when the reform agenda was established, there were three main objectives, and they were really balancing priorities. First of all was cost-effective outcomes for consumers, because obviously this was driven by concerns about price. So that's both for domestic and business customers. Secondly, that needed to be balanced against maintaining a viable, sustainable and competitive electricity industry, because without making sure that the industry has adequate returns, then the consumer ultimately over the long term won't get good outcomes. And finally, particularly given the state's balance sheet and funding issues, it had to be cost effective for government. So the answer wasn't obviously to transfer all of that to subsidies. So out of that came 62 recommendations, so it was a very large body of work. There were three strategies. The first one is to stop building unnecessary infrastructure and improve efficiency of network businesses. Secondly, to capture the benefits of competition with adequate consumer protections. And lastly, to define a more effective role for government. So as Malcolm and the Minister both said, networks have been a very large contributor to the large price increases in the last 6-7 years. So, you know, network costs are contributing 50% of the bill, and they are also being challenged by new technologies that are coming online, such as solar, air conditioning contributing to the peak, and the problems with volumetric charging. So in considering that problem, the IDC came up with recommendations addressing the supply side, so looking at the network businesses themselves, and that largely came out of the IRP work, which was that independent review panel. And the key platforms were to drive efficiency in network operations. So how can we make these businesses leaner and reduce their operating costs? Secondly was looking at making sure that networks are only built to the optimal level. So they are no more reliable or no more built than there needs to be to ensure consistent and reliable supply. And finally, the last one was around better regulation and network planning. So then we also looked at the demand side. So we needed to look at ways to incentivise a more efficient use of networks. So it's fine to make the network businesses as efficient as they can, but if we also don't have the right price signals on the other side so that consumers are incentivised to use them more efficiently, that will just add to overall costs. So we looked at things such as tariff structures, so there is a tariff strategy that is underway to try and make sure that the price signals sent to customers incentivise the right behaviours, or that if people were contributing to further investment in network, that they would be paying for that. Also looking at opportunities for demand management, so the ability to shift load to reduce prices, and also to help facilitate all of that, looking at advanced metering and how that could be rolled out. And as indicated, a clear message from government is that it wouldn't be a mandated rollout. So strategy 2, which looks at unlocking the benefits of competition, there's two distinct strategies there. First of all, in terms of the South East Queensland, as Malcolm said, there is a high level of competition, although we still have regulated prices. So the government's indicated that it would move to a price monitoring or a light-handed regulation in South East Queensland, subject to certain preconditions. And they're things like testing the adequacy of competition and making sure that there's consumer protections in place. Then in regional Queensland, again, as Malcolm said, that is more challenging because of the way the regional customers are subsidised through the uniform tariff policy. So we're now looking at a way to take the subsidy away from the government-owned retailer and putting it into the network. And then in 2016, we're targeting opening the retail to competition. To make all that work, clearly you need engaged and empowered customers, because without understanding what all that means, it's unlikely that this will succeed. And importantly, we're having a look at hardship and concessions to make sure that as we move into this new framework, that those that are most vulnerable are adequately protected. So the third strategy is making sure that the government role is adequately defined and effective. So that includes a stable regulatory and policy environment, so there's less risk of shocks through prices and unnecessary government intervention. It also includes removing unnecessary red tape, leveraging national energy reforms where they are advantageous for Queensland, and also looking at government ownership of government ownership of electricity businesses in line with the Commission of Audit report. And as the Minister said, network privatisation is off the table, but certainly there will be investigations into generation and potentially retail. So all of those reforms are really targeted to create a more efficient system with better cost outcomes for customers, more competition and a stable regulatory environment to incentivise that going forward. And that is really to address more the 1 to 3 year time horizon or the short-term pressures in the system. Then longer term, we have released the 30-year electricity strategy discussion paper. So this strategy is again looking at the whole of supply chain, and the aim is really to set out a roadmap to create an adaptive, flexible supply system going forward. And again, all things are on the table. It's a 3-stage process. So late last year, we outlined the directions paper, which really helped define the problem. Again, talking about cost drivers, what the price increases were, and what we're looking at. The discussion paper summarises a lot of the IDC reforms that I've just talked about, but also goes into some scenario planning about the future, which I'll talk about. We have that open for consultation at the moment, and that closes on the 6th of December, and then we hope to incorporate all that feedback to come up with a final strategy mid-next year. What's really critical, and I know the Minister talked about this, is making sure that there is a shared vision for the future. So unlike 30 years ago, the government no longer owns the whole supply chain. So importantly, there's privatised generation and retail, so the industry itself and the market is critical to the success going forward, but also the important role of customer. So the customer's uptake of new technology such as solar is really driving changes to the sector like never before. So we really need the customer engaged and understand how their behaviour may impact the system going forward. So just breaking that down a little bit more, we did a current state versus future state analysis to really understand, well, what does it look like today? What are the problems today? And really, what are we aiming for in 30 years' time? So at a high level, we said in terms of customers, they have suffered unsustainable price shocks, limited choice and control, and many would argue a lot of them aren't engaged in the electricity sector. Businesses may be slightly different because it is such a critical input to their costs. The sector is complex and difficult to understand, and industry competitiveness is at risk if prices continue to go up. But going forward, our goal is to be cost effective, have greater levels of choice and control for customers, greater level of transparency in terms of understanding what the costs are, and economic growth is encouraged. In terms of the market, we're looking at an inefficient use of assets, particularly around networks, as has been discussed. We have a non-diversified fuel source, so generation is heavily reliant on coal and other fossil fuels like gas. Investment uncertainty continues, so the continual debate around carbon and the replacement schemes mean that it's very difficult for investment in new generation assets. Luckily, at the moment, we do have an oversupply, but at some point that could shift and that may create a problem. And we have varying levels of competition. Going forward, the future state, we're looking at a much more efficient use of assets to help drive some of those costs down. Choices in generation mix, so moving to a more diversified generation mix. Investment attraction, so if and when we do need new investment, it is there. And of course, competitive markets. And then from a government perspective, we've had at state and federal level misaligned environmental schemes, complex regulation that makes it very difficult to understand, and hardship policy challenges. So we have some hardship groups missing out, and then we have other people who are possibly getting subsidies that may not necessarily need them. Going forward, we're looking at sustainable, cost-effective supply, effective regulation, and which means unnecessary intervention, and equitable and sustainable hardship support. So targeting that to people who most need it. So to inform the future, we thought it was useful to go back 30 years and have a look at what we looked like then and what's changed. And that's been an interesting exercise. So looking at that as a high-level graphic, what that is trying to show is that lifestyle has changed significantly. So our population has almost doubled. House sizes have increased by approximately a third for an average household. Incomes have gone up by more than almost 10%. And with that additional level of discretionary income has increased appliances. So we're using appliances differently, much more take-up of air conditioning, much more appliances in terms of, two TVs per household versus one. So obviously that's driving a whole level of different consumption pattern and demand on the system. Then in terms of how we use electricity, that's also significantly changed. So the one on the left is indicating that it was a fairly simple, stable regulatory supply chain. Queensland was isolated. Today we have a national market and we have a complex regulatory framework. So we have certain levels of state-based regulation around retail competition, but we also have national regulation around our network businesses. And in terms of technology, that's certainly driven a lot of changes across the supply chain. So 30 years ago, typically we had coal-fired baseload power stations that were responding to steadily increasing demand and very predictable demand. Today, we have a more diversified fuel mix. We've obviously got gas contributing significantly in Queensland, but importantly, other new technologies, and as Malcolm said, we've had a significant take-up in solar. So again, technology changes have been significant, and that's probably going to continue, if not accelerate. So I think probably looking at that, anyone standing back in the early 80s would find it difficult to foresee the future that we have today. So then looking at the potential for the next 30 years, again, it's impossible to accurately define what that future will look like, but we were able to say, well, there are a number of drivers that we think will shape the future going forward, and that includes technology, climate variability policy, customer engagement and empowerment, levels of competition and market structure, and issues of fuel security. So what we're seeing at a high level is a potential shift away from large fossil fuel baseload power stations into more diversified generation, and that includes generation at the household level or business level, so embedded generation, so not drawing it all from the networks. A move away from the linear supply system, and by that I mean on the left side you see the power station going through to the high voltage transmission lines, then across to the poles and wires in the distribution network, then effectively through your retailer, consumers being billed for the electricity supplied. Going forward, there is less reliance on the network. What that will mean in 30 years' time is difficult to say, but certainly we are seeing the emergence of microgrids, so off large networks, embedded generation, and things such as battery technology, what will that mean, and the emergence of electric vehicles. So what we did is we used a lot of those variables to try and develop a range of scenarios, because again, it kind of depends. So if climate variability policy increases, we may see a more rapid shift to renewables and low emissions alternatives. In the absence of that or a price signal, we may see a generation sector more similar to what we see today. So we then used those variables to test what the future might look like and came up with some key themes. So in terms of making electricity, so in terms of generation, we see there's probably going to be some shifts in the generation mix, and the challenges around that will be how do we make sure that we deploy cost-effective new generation alternatives and as and when they're required. So attracting investment in generation, because the government's certainly been clear that it is stepping away from providing generation going forward. In terms of moving electricity, so network businesses, again, disruption to that traditional network business model. So the fact that everyone draws power from the poles and wires outside, which comes from a large power station, hundreds of kilometres away, that model is clearly under threat. So we need to look at how we can support structural change to that system in a way that doesn't create huge cost impacts for customers. And finally, the social and economic impacts of the changing system. So in terms of selling and consuming electricity, making sure that we are having engaged customers, but they are adequately protected. And importantly, particularly for this audience, maximising economic growth as we transition to that future. So I guess the question is often asked, why do we look at the 30-year time horizon? And having been through this exercise, it is very challenging. It is very challenging for industry groups, consumer groups, governments to really look past about 5 years. It gets very difficult and very foggy. But the government is stretching us, and I think that's a good thing because it helps not only support the short-term reform agenda and make sure it's headed in that long-term direction, but also is helping us shape an environment for a resilient and efficient system going forward, which is obviously important for the lifestyles and also the economy. So again, we are keen for feedback. As I said, the directions paper, the discussion paper is currently open and consultation on that closes on the 6th of December. We are having some industry workshops which are underway and kick off tomorrow and continue into next week. And we are having participation from industry groups at that. So certainly we've been talking with Nick and encouraging feedback through this forum, but we also encourage feedback from individual groups, domestic users and businesses. So we would certainly encourage you to have a look on our website and register your interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. When CCIQ set about setting up this morning, we wanted to structure the morning in 3 distinct segments. The first really was around, I guess, defining what the problem was. You know, what is the catalyst for change? The second component then was what possible government intervention and action may look like, which is what Karen has been taking us through. The third and perhaps most important element of this morning is providing business with a say on the 30-year electricity strategy, and that's what we intend to do through the workshop that will be held immediately afterwards. Prior to that, however, we intend to conduct a Q&A session with our expert panel, and you've heard a very scripted level of information provided to you thus far, and hopefully we're going to be a bit more entertaining, and although it was very informative, a bit more scripted and candid, answers to some questions. So I'd like to invite Karen and Malcolm back up to the stage, if I may, but I'd also like to introduce Alan Jones, who is Chief Executive Officer and founder of Power Choice Energy. Power Choice began trading in 2009. Their vision is to help small businesses save money on their electricity costs by offering specialist electricity broker services. Power Choice's mission is to enable its clients to optimise energy acquisition costs and effectively manage energy usage. I'd also like to introduce Chris Thompson, who is the founder and managing director of Infinity Power. Chris is an electrical engineer with an additional electrical trade qualification. He manages all operational related issues for Infinity Solar. The Infinity Group, which includes Infinity Power and Infinity Solar, was founded in 2007 and has gone on to become one of the largest providers of renewable energy solutions in Australia. I'd like to now invite questions from the floor. We do have a roving microphone. However, to get the panel warmed up, we have also received some questions via email and also some questions on our Twitter feed, which I might get the panel warmed up now with. Malcolm, the first question is, what can be done to facilitate electricity retail competition in regional Queensland?
Well, this is one of those strange examples where good intentions lead to unforeseen consequences. The uniform tariff policy is offering regional customers the same notified price as the customers in the southeast, despite the fact that the cost of delivering electricity in the regions is significantly higher, possibly about 30% higher, due to the additional network costs, transmission line losses, etc. So the government policy providing that benefit to customers, expensive, $620 million this year, is being delivered via the retail arm, if you like, of Ergon. Now, that effectively means that private retailers are not able to compete for most customers in the regions. They're not able to match the price that Ergon is able to provide courtesy of the subsidy. So the government's asked us to have a look at that. Karen's department's doing quite a lot of work in that space as well. We're looking at, I suppose, a couple problems. One, what should the subsidy really be? Who should be receiving it? What does the uniform really mean? And so there's some issues there for government to decide about who they wish to support. And then there's the question about how can that subsidy be delivered through perhaps the Ergon network business rather than the retail business. So in effect, we provide the benefit to the regional customers, but we don't stifle competition in the process. That'll take a little time to do, but one of the things that we always encounter when we go out, twice a year I'm the most popular or unpopular person in Queensland because I have to announce what the prices are going to be. When we go and talk to regional customers, they feel frustrated that they don't have a choice of retailer. They notice the competition in the southeast. They'd like to have competition, and certainly we would like to see more competition for them.
Thank you very much. Karen, is price deregulation and negotiating a market contract good for business consumers?
And that's a really interesting question, because that's a question that government was asking of us, and I think that that's something governments can be very nervous about, because people often see regulation as some level of price protection. But I think through a lot of independent reviews, both interstate regulators, Productivity Commission, etc., have done quite a lot of research to indicate that really having a price cap there can sometimes be more detrimental to competition. So, for example, retailers are not entering the market, or the ability, as good as Malcolm is, his ability to actually pick what the price should be.
I'm a very poor substitute for a good market.
Exactly. But having said that, so I say the answer is yes, but the government was very cautious about moving to that step. So what it's done is set preconditions. So it's saying it's targeting retail competition in 2015, but it does want to firstly satisfy itself that there is effective competition, and the mechanism for that's yet to be determined, but it could be a review by the AEMC. Make sure that there's adequate protections and hardship arrangements, and what else is there? Oh, and making sure that customers are effectively engaged. So moving quickly towards deregulation without really bringing the customers on the journey is really fraught with problems.
Thank you very much. Alan, how do we improve business understanding their experiences with retailers and their capacity to manage contracts?
I think that managing contracts is quite a complex area. In fact, Malcolm only doesn't regulate the whole of the business in Queensland. He regulates the small market, and so there are various types of contracts, and some small businesses have good protection from the Energy and Water Ombudsman for those contracts. Other businesses who are a large market really have the only recourse is the magistrates' court if they have a contract dispute with their retailer. In that case, bad contract management could be business termination event. People, I guess, in those businesses still think that it's the big, happy, friendly, government-owned energy supplier. And these days, in those particular markets, it's a very aggressive, commercial environment that can terminate businesses if managed incorrectly. So, in terms of risk management, I think that generally speaking, as that cost increases, managing that risk in the business is extremely important. I think that if you've got an accountant or you've got an energy advisor or you've got a solicitor who looks after law, we would recommend businesses pay attention to that risk in their business.
Thank you. And Chris, what can be done to diversify the generation mix of energy and also the location of generation in Queensland?
Well, I'd like to start that I spent the first 15 or 20 years of my life on the black side of power generation and the last 5 to 10 in the green side, so I sort of understand both sides of the fence, but there is always a mix needed in any generation portfolio. baseload power stations have their place, but I think the challenge is probably challenging the design of old and the thinking of old in how traditional power stations are fossil fuel, usually large and dirty, so they have to be hundreds of kilometres away, which means we've got to then transport the power to the load centres. And I think the challenge is trying to get generation as close to load as possible, so embedded generation, and that embraces technologies like renewables and also smart systems such as battery storage and everything. We talk to a lot of clients, and their biggest need is, what can I do behind my meter in my backyard to help my energy costs? And I think exploring all of those, and we spend a lot of time educating clients about the possibilities that are out there, the innovations that are available. So it was quite pleasing to hear some of the presentations earlier about looking forward to the 30-year strategy involving those embedded generation technologies.
Thank you very much. So questions from the floor? Yes, we have one here on table 19.
I need to do a sound check.
I got a big voice anyway. So
Good. Very, very pleased.
never rely on technology. You will fail you at a critical moment. I work in the oil industry where we have cogeneration. We are reliant on natural gas supply. I have a couple of questions. First of all, once Australia starts shipping our CNG overseas, Australia will work its way into the world parity price for gas, and that's going to significantly increase the cost of gas. I see from one of the slides there in tiny writing, I think that in Queensland about 26% of our generation is gas-fired, so that cost is going to go up whether the carbon tax goes down or not. I think Nick mentioned we owe $16 billion within the generators. Is that correct?
I think it was 13 and a half.
13 and a half.
And it's
something like
costing us $500 million a year to fund that in interest. I'm just wondering where that money sits in the pool of government. Is that government debt? Is it private debt? Is it corporate debt? Where that sits? And how is that funded? And the second question is, of course, how do the panel see the change in the cost of natural gas affecting generation? 26% of our generation is gas-fired currently, and that price will shift possibly by about 30 or 40% within 2 years.
It's a very good question indeed. The particular emphasis on this morning is really about electricity and competition, perhaps in the retailing of electricity. But indeed, you are correct to identify that there's actually competition across energy sources. So I might hand it over to the panel. Is there anyone in particular who?
Oh, I can talk to the.
Yep.
I'll start.
Karen?
Sorry, I can't see you.
Yes,
but,
wrong part there.
in terms of where the debt sits, so the debt you're talking about was, I think if it was the $13.5 billion is in the network businesses. So that sits in the government-owned corporations themselves, but that does get consolidated up into the whole of state balance sheet. The rate of return is actually more than the debt as well. So the debt is one component of a return that the regulator will allow based on the cost of capital or the WACC that Malcolm talked about. So that's where you see, even if they paid the debt down to zero, the way the regulator determines it is a notional average return for a network business. So you would still have that return sitting in there in your electricity prices. In terms of gas, completely agree with you, and already the forward market for wholesale energy or electricity prices is trending upwards. There's a lot of work both at the state level and the national level around what's going to happen with domestic gas, both in terms of the impact on electricity prices, but also people who use gas for industrial processing are having a lot of trouble getting a contract on gas.
That's right. Just to add very briefly to that, Western Australia's had this problem for a few years now. The netback price, as they refer to it, so essentially what would be the export price minus the costs that you incur in producing the product for export becomes effectively the price in the domestic market. And one of the problems, as Karen just mentioned, has been people looking for gas on long-term contracts. A few years ago, when the LNG boom was being predicted for Queensland, there was an expectation there'd be short-term abundance of gas on the market. Ramp-up gas would be there. The gas was being produced before the LNG trains were in operation, and so we'd have a short-term abundance of gas. But unfortunately, it's also been the case that that hasn't really happened. That the availability of gas on long-term contracts is essential for people to make investments in new manufacturing or generation assets. And that's created a great question mark, I suppose, about making those investments.
I think it's also worthwhile to note that the question really drives down to what component of that generation capacity is driving the price. Really comes down to, what percentage of gas. And gas has a different style of production. It's more instantaneous than coal-fired base. So again, quoting the famous physicist Niels Bohr, as we've seen, forecasting is very difficult about the future. And so I think that, we love to see experts give their propositions and forecasts of the future, but what we've learned this morning is that the future's unknowable. And I think that whether we see 7 years, what 7 years' time or 5 years' time, what percentage of the price of electricity will the gas price be is unknowable, given the solar boom, given the different changes of the nature of the networks being rolled out, and indeed government policy. So I think that you should always sort of underpin these things to say, well, hang on, this is nice to discuss, but in reality, we don't know what that impact will be. No one knows.
But the government does have to take some lessons from the Western Australian government, where Western Australian government had to intervene and impose laws to restrict how much gas was actually put into the domestic use pipe and business use pipe, as opposed to what was put on a boat exported. And obviously what that did to the price in that time. I mean, I was writing gas contracts at the time where it was $2 to $3 a gigajoule, and then what seemed to be overnight, might have been over 12 to 18 months, jumped to $6 and $8 a gigajoule, and now you can't buy a gas contract for under $8. So we do have to heed some learnings that they had, and obviously make sure that we're not caught short here as well.
Okay. So next question on table 4.
I'll take my chances on the technology's working for me. Thanks. Steve Wilson from Wilson HTM Investment Group. 2 questions, both about this whole theme of cost. I was struck that electricity prices have risen by 260% since the year 2000, so over 13 years, according to your graph. And secondly, that today, of the order of 50% of the cost is transmission. My first question is, what was that 13 years ago? So in other words, the increase, is it 50% caused by transmission costs? And I suspect it's not, because you also had charts saying that actually generators have gone backwards in terms of, and then my second question is that, given that the gorilla in the room is 50% of the costs is transmission, what international benchmarking have you done, or is proposed to be done, including Australian benchmarking, as to the efficiency of the big cost item?
Okay. Well, the first part of that, Steve, is that yes, there's been a change in the distribution of costs. Obviously, as you pointed out, that with the wholesale energy price much higher in 1998, clearly networks have become a larger proportion of the bill. Can't give you an exact number going back 10 years or so, but that's definitely happened. The question about benchmarking has been looked at by the Productivity Commission recently. There was a review by the PC last year, the inter-network regulation, and in particular about how useful benchmarking might be as a regulatory tool. Now, the Australian Energy Regulator sets network prices. They hadn't really used benchmarking widely for their determinations. Just for a little bit of background, folks, the AER makes a decision that sets in place for 5 years, essentially a price cap or a revenue cap for each network business around the country. So they hadn't used benchmarking extensively. The Productivity Commission was reasonably cautious about the value of benchmarking, and some of the benchmarking studies I've seen show that you can get a sense of how the businesses are operating, but also their structures, their markets do be quite different. In Victoria, for example, you've got 5 distribution businesses, some very heavily concentrated just in part of Melbourne, and the density of their customer base, the amount of business they do is very different to Powling, for example, which is a transmission business, or Ergon, which has got a very, very large but quite small customer base. So benchmarking's got some value. It does give people a sense perhaps where things are very much out of kilter, but it's not necessarily the best tool to work out about efficiency. I think the key thing of all regulation, and you know, it's sad to say this, but you know, regulators can't get it right. Regulators are a very poor substitute for a market, an efficient market. But regulators do need to take a variety of sources to try and work out what the information, what the best data shows. But we also need to have regulatory systems that provide incentives for the right behaviour. And you know, one of the arguments last year about the network businesses was that the incentives weren't strong enough to push efficiency in those businesses. And again, the AER had an opportunity to have an efficiency benefit sharing scheme for CapEx for the networks, and they hadn't put it in place. They are now doing it. So I think the key thing there is, one, getting incentives right, so the businesses have got a reward for efficiency, and that efficiency is a key priority for them.
And I would just add to that, one of the key reasons benchmarking is difficult is that networks build to certain standards, and they are, so in Queensland, the Queensland government sets the reliability standard, and that standard went up significantly after blackouts a number of years ago. So that actually contributed, as well as peak demand, that itself contributed to significant cost increases. So this government is now looking at resetting those standards so that they aren't built to such a high level of reliability. So that's a reliability and cost trade-off.
Karen, do you think that businesses are prepared to forego some reliability to yield a lower electricity price?
Well, I think there is some research to show that businesses are probably less interested in foregoing reliability because of the need for reliability or electricity as an input to their business. But households, for example, may have more of an appetite to do it. There have been some studies done, so for example in New South Wales, but the problem is because the investment is now there, and I think Malcolm made the comment that it's quite new investment,
yes,
it would actually take a number of years before the cost benefits flow through the system. So you're actually trading off some reliability, which again will taper off into the future for a future return. So that would have been a better question for us before they built it all.
Yeah, and the New South Wales study that Karen's referring to was done by the AEMC, and they did a calculation that if they change the reliability standards now, I think by 2028, the average New South Wales household will save $15 a year. You know, so when the money is sunk into the network, the costs have to be recovered over a long period of time. Changing the reliability standards will over time change the capacity that's being built into the network, but it takes a very long time before that manifests itself into any significant saving.
Well, from the demand side, Alan and Chris, you're face-to-face with customers a lot. Do you think they're willing to forego reliability to get lower prices?
I think that it's worthwhile just making the note that the structure we have of the assets, we own the powers and wires, and we own the asset that's been spent. And so whether it's not a third party, Energex isn't not some sort of third party or Ergon, it's actually us, we own them. And we've made a decision through our areas to make an asset. That has to be paid back sometime. Someone has to pay for the poles and wires, and that someone is us. So the question being is, can we trade off reliability for a lower cost? Absolutely. And I think that's worthwhile doing. But Karen's point was this, and I think I'll reiterate that, is that our current asset that we've already got on the ground has to be paid for. Now, when that gets depreciated and comes off our balance sheet, our corporate balance sheet, then we can look at ways in which we can have discretionary use of electricity to minimise that next round of capital acquisition. But that's really the benefit will be a marginal one until that wave of capital has sort of passed through our economy. But in saying that, I think that in this case, it's always good to do an industry study which has an average, which is not meaningful. In fact, I've never known an average business in my life. In fact, 50% of above average, 50% of below average. But finding the average business is very hard. But in saying that, people do have a lot of generation capability for standby at the moment in certain industries, and certainly they would have that asset that's been underutilised or not utilised for emergencies that they could use to get some more return on. I think that's worthwhile discovering, and I think the best person to determine that isn't a regulator, it's the market. I think if you can create the right sort of market environment, government step out of the way and let people make their own decisions. I think the best thing that can happen.
And I think that I can agree with that as well. As clients are willing to invest in safeguarding their own operations, right? And that comes at a fairly minimal cost, really. So to save money by having a maybe less reliable power supply, in the overall scheme of things, I think is something most businesses have already. They can't afford to lose power, so they've already got UPS systems and things, safeguards built into their environment already. And I mean, the biggest challenge for all businesses have is that, you know, businesses that play in a market where they make a commodity or make something that has a market price, we can't just impose a 10% increase in power and hope that they can pass that 10% on to their clients, because the fact of the matter is they can't. So they're always looking at how can we curb the cost of electricity in our business so that we can remain competitive and profitable.
We've got time for one quick question. Yes?
Nick Dimas is my name. I'm the president of the Redfield Peninsula Chamber and owner of the Golden Ox restaurant on the peninsula. Thanks to CCIQ and UNIC for putting this together today. My question to the panel, and also, you know, maybe through Karen to the minister later on, is this: 60% of our members in our chamber earn less than $50,000 a year. The difference in the power bills, the way they have gone up, some of them up to 40% last year, is between survival and closing their doors. We know members that have gone into depression, members that lose their business, and members that are devastated, they lose their marriages. Now, to those people, what are we going to do as a community, as a society? And we know that the government has found this problem, but what are we going to do to address and alleviate some of their problem? Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think that the problem you articulate is one that the Minister is acutely aware of. He has a lot of visits from consumer and business groups, and for that reason, I think that's why the government has so strongly got this on their agenda, and I know that it is in the Premier's top 3, which is obviously important when it comes to sitting around the cabinet table, because a lot of these reforms do have winners and losers. Some of the reforms are difficult, but the government, I think, has the courage to do some of the difficult things to help alleviate those cost pressures going forward. I think personally one of the biggest challenges for government in the next while will be what happens with solar bonus, and you know, Malcolm's graph and some numbers coming out of Energex confirm that there are some existing things in the system, previous government policies that are just really contributing to costs, and they are a real problem that we need to somehow grapple with.
Yesterday we saw some business community scepticism whether or not we're going to see the savings from the removal of the carbon pricing mechanism. Do you think we will see those savings?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the debate about the carbon price is missing the point that at the moment that cost is there. It's been imposed on businesses, retail customers. You may think that's reasonable, you may think that's a good policy, and you're in favour of a carbon price, you may not, but it's undeniable that cost is there. If you're the typical Tariff 11 customer, so you're a typical residential user, that's $109 or thereabouts. If you also have off-peak power, Tariff 31, Tariff 33, there's another $60 or so there. That's purely liability imposed by government policy. Whether you agree with the policy or not doesn't really matter at this point. That's the cost. Now, when the tax is removed, notified prices will be adjusted to reflect that. So I think what people are probably confusing, though, is the fact that people are saying, oh, well, if the carbon tax is going to be reduced, electricity prices next year will be lower. The carbon tax, as I showed today, is just one part of your bill. There are other cost pressures. Cost pressures I've hopefully showed today that have been around for some time, that have been converging for a long time to push up prices, and they will not change because the carbon tax is changing.
So 2 parts to it. Yes, your bill will be lower than it would otherwise be when you don't have a carbon tax to pay. Does that mean your bill is going to be lower next year than it is this year? I can't say that. We'll have to wait until we've done the numbers and we put out our draft determination, our final determination in May. But as part of the purpose of the presentation today was to show a number of different factors that are pushing up your power bills. Changing one doesn't mean that you're going to get a lower power bill next year. But you will have a lower bill than you would have had if we kept the carbon tax.
Thank you. I've got one final question to the panel, and it's a yes/no answer. And Karen, you can take the fifth on this if you'd like. Should Queensland privatise their electricity assets? Starting with you, Chris.
Well, look, industry, when you bring
yes,
business
no, we're on the clock.
Yes, generation only, yes.
I think that government ownership of an asset that it regulates, that it seeks a return on, in the long term is bad for everyone.
I take that as a yes.
That's a yes.
In the long term.
And I'm just a humble regulator, so this is a private opinion. Yes.
Karen?
I'm being gutless and taking the fifth, I'm afraid.
From a sample of 3, we've got overwhelming consensus that we should be privatising our state's electricity assets. Look, I'd like to thank the panellists for their informed commentary on a number of issues. We've got a small token of appreciation that I'll hand to you shortly. Today's forum will be televised off the CCIQ website. As I said, we are now conducting a workshop next door, so for those that are registered to attend, we're going to get underway at about 9 o'clock, so if you can kindly make your way out the door, and it's the first room on the right. And again, thank you very much for coming along this morning. It's a burning issue for Queensland business, but I think you can see there is some resolve from this state government to addressing the problem, and it starts with forums and workshops like today. So thank you very much.